In the final weeks of November, the Lewis and Clark expeditioners were parked near the beaches of the Pacific Ocean. The captains picked men to reconnoiter the coastal landscape for a better, drier, warmer, and more secure location to build a winter quarters. They had logistics to consider, especially since their ability to barter for food with the Indians was severely hampered by diminished supplies of gifts. On November 24, Captain William Clark wrote,
"Being now determined to go into winter quarters as soon as possible, as a convenient situation to procure the wild animals of the forest, which must be our dependence for subsisting this winter. We have every reason to believe that the natives have not provisions sufficient for our consumption, and if they had, their prices are too high, that it would take 10 times as much to purchase their roots and dried fish as we have in our possession, including our small remains of merchandise and clothes, etc."
According to Stephen Ambrose's account, on the morning of December 8th, Clark set out looking for a salt-making operation near present-day Astoria, Washington. It turned out to be located more than a dozen miles from the site of the eventual Fort Clatsop. Salt is a vital preserver of meat needed for the return journey, and probably was a welcome ingredient in daily meals that were repetitive and boring. Co-Captain Meriwether Lewis set men to work cutting trees, but the preservation of meat and the rainy climate required, quote, "extraordinary measures," Lewis admitted. On December 16th, Clark wrote of a violent wind, trees, quote, "falling in every direction, rain, hail, and thunder all day long.
Certainly one of the worst days ever.
Too many men were sick or injured. Some had tumors. Even fleas joined the mayhem." From the Indians, according to Clark. By December 17, though, enough walls of the fort were up to allow some of the party to move in. The captains moved into their unfinished hut on December 23. Private Field made writing tables, even though the roof was still only partially constructed. Fort Clatsop, about 50 square feet with 2 gates, consisted of an enlisted men's quarters and 4 rooms, one for the captains, one for Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and son John Baptiste, one to serve as an orderly room, and the 4th the smokehouse. At first light on Christmas, 1805, the men woke the captains with a gun salute, shout, and a song. Among the presents exchanged, White House gave Clark, and probably Lewis too, a pair of moccasins he made himself. Private Goodrich gave a basket of berries. Sacagawea offered up 24 white weasel tails, and Captain Lewis gave Clark a vest underwear, and socks. The smokers among the party indulged in some tobacco not reserved for the Indians. Non-smokers each got a handkerchief. Since Lewis wasn't writing much at this time, it is not clear what he received at the festivity. Shortly after Christmas Day, Clark's, quote, man, York, became, quote,
very unwell with a violent cold and strained by carrying meat from the woods and lifting the heavy logs on the works.
On December 29, Clark recorded that
The fleas, so numerous in this country and difficult to get clear of, that the Indians have different houses and villages in which they remove frequently to rid themselves of them. And notwithstanding all their precautions, they never step into our hut without leaving swarms of those troublesome insects.
finally on December 30, Ordway wrote that the sun had come out.
A little sun shine, which is very uncommon at this place.
New Year's 1806 brought more celebrations, and Lewis from then began to write more regularly in his diary journal again. He had begun some notes already in late November after an unexplained hiatus. There was no more whiskey to cheer the men, so celebrants of the new year indulged in, quote, pure water, in addition to a treat of elk marrowbone and tongue. Lewis notes the excessive fondness among the Indians of smoking tobacco, but, quote,
these people do not appear to know the use of spirituous liquors, they never having once asked us for it. I presume, therefore, that the traders who visit them have never indulged them with the use of it. From whatever cause this may proceed, it is a very fortunate occurrence, as well for the natives themselves, as for the quiet and safety of those whites who visit them.
Lewis wrote out a detailed order for, quote, the exact and uniform discipline and government of the garrison. Among the prerequisites, both gates of the fort were to be closed and all Indians were to be out of the fort at sunset, with occasional exceptions allowed by the captains. The need to be wary of the Indians, especially the Chinooks, was a particular concern of Captain Lewis, who noted a tendency of them to
great avarice and hope of plunder. We determined all the ways to be on our guard and never place ourselves at the mercy of any savages. We well know the treachery of the Aborigines of America, and that too great confidence of our country and sincerity and friendship has caused the destruction of many hundreds of us.
Lewis retained a rather critical, suspicious perception of Native Americans, as was widely shared by Eastern settlers in those days. A canoe went missing at high tide, but almost a month later in February, Sergeant Gass found it
So long lost and lamented.
Otherwise, life in the camp day after day seemed relatively uneventful, even dull. Nothing worthy of note today, were words issued from Lewis's pen. The men had sex for diversion, but venereal disease would haunt them, apparently. Goodrich and McNeil had contracted the disease, according to Lewis, who sought to cure the problems with mercury. These men and others died after the expedition returned home at a relatively young age, and some historians speculate that syphilis contributed to the outcome. Most indications suggest neither of the captains entertained native women in such a manner throughout the journey. Captain Lewis said
The Indians do not hold the virtue of their women in high estimation, and will even prostitute their wives and daughters for a fish hook or string of bead.
they also treat their old and infirm as though they had lived long enough. At some point it is time for them to die and to go to their already departed relations, who can afford to take care of them much better than the community can. The dead are buried in canoes. A small canoe is placed in the ground, in which the body is laid after it is carefully rolled in a robe or dressed skins. A paddle is also deposited with the departed. However, to the strangers in their midst, most local tribe members were friendly, in spite of an apparent predisposition to pilfer when the opportunity presented itself. According to Lewis, Indians were very friendly to two of the men who had gone out and seemingly had been lost. They were given a considerable quantity of blubber of a whale that had been washed up on the coast.
It was white and not unlike the fat of pork.
A winter storm struck on January 26, leaving about 5 inches of white powder for the first time all winter. Other sicknesses were visited upon the men, like the flu, common cold, and fever. About mid-February, Lewis noted that 5 men were in the sick bay.
We have not had as many sick at any one time since we left Wood River. I expect when we get underway, we shall be much more healthy. It has always had that effect on us heretofore.
The Corps of Discovery was, quote, counting the days. There were no ships anchoring offshore to provide supplemental gifts for the Indians it would encounter on their return trip to St. Louis, and none to pick up any of the Corps members. An April 1 date was scheduled initially for the party to pack up and head east, up the Columbia, down the Missouri. But of course they had to pass the Rocky Mountains one more time. The humid climate of the Pacific Northwest and a poor selection of food had worn on everyone. Although the captains noted that the winter was much warmer on the coast than they expected. Moreover, as the captains expected, it wasn't easy to find enough game to feed some 3 dozen people every day. But hunt and find they did. Private Drouillard was the best of the shooters. Lewis recorded 7 elk killed by Drouillard in a single day.
I scarcely know how we should subsist were it not for the exertions of this excellent hunter.
Lewis. More than 130 elk were killed and consumed over the 3 months of wintering at Clatsop. Again, out of necessity, dogs also came under the knife. Besides dried fish and roots, Lewis himself was slow to develop a fondness for dog, but he did finally concede.
I have become so perfectly reconciled to the dog that I think it is an agreeable food, and would prefer it vastly to lean venison or elk.
A remarkable confession, but not one widely repeated in modern American retelling of the expedition's highlights. Lewis kept notes on both the nature and the geography and the Native Americans surrounding them.
The Killamucks, Clatsops, Chinooks, Cathlamucks, and Wackacooms resemble each other as well in their persons and dress as in their habits and manners. The most remarkable trait in physiognomy is the peculiar flatness and width of forehead which they artificially obtain by compressing the head between 2 boards while in a state of infancy.
As such, Lewis pointed out that most Indian nations east of the Rockies refer to all Indians west of the mountains as flatheads. Lewis did renew his focus on the nature all around him during this period. Among the trees he recorded white pine, Douglas fir, grand fir, and western hemlock. Native wild animals included the brown, white, or grizzly bear, black bear, red deer, black-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, wolf, foxes, antelope, sheep, beaver, otter, squirrels, rats, mouse, moles, hare, rabbit, and polecat, or skunk. Aquatic birds are the very large blue and brown heron, fishing hawk, blue-crested fisher, gulls, cormorant, loons, geese, small and large swan, snakes, like the rattler and garter snake, and numerous species of ducks. In the ocean and river, Lewis identified whale, porpoise, skate, flounder, anchovy, several salmon types like char, coho, and trout, among many other. The captains were anxious to move their departure date up to mid-March, but weather didn't cooperate. The party also had few articles left to trade for canoes or other necessities, eventually more horses. Before closing up Clatsop, Lewis approved the theft of one of the Indian canoes since buying one would cost too much. He rationalized that all was even given that the Indians stole 6 elk earlier in the year. This incident was alluded to by Sergeant Ordway, but not officially recorded. Before leaving the coast, Lewis summed up his feelings this way.
Although we have not fared sumptuously this winter and spring at Fort Clatsop, we have lived quite as comfortably as we had any reason to expect we should, and have accomplished every object which induced our remaining at this place, except that of meeting with the traders who visit the entrance of this river.
About noon, March 23, the Corps of Discovery finally set off from Fort Clatsop, headed east and toward home. On board the ships was a supply of 338 pair of moccasins, most made from the skins of elk, according to Sergeant Gass. Each man also had a sufficient quantity of patch leather. The party had learned its lesson on the westbound trip.
The leafing of the huckleberry reminds us of spring.
Lewis wrote.